Hello, good morning. This is a bonus midweek Flosstube that is for everybody to watch, but is primarily being made for the participants of the stitch along that Teresa Bonetti, Kitten Stitcher, is running for the beautiful Margaret Doyle. Those reds and blues, they glow like rubies and sapphires. It is such a charming little sampler. Teresa has written to me with some questions about Margaret that have been asked by participants of the Stitch Along and by herself. One of the questions is, what do I think the boy on Margaret Doyle's sampler is doing? Well, I'm not so sure if that is a boy. Now, this sampler was featured in a Whitney catalogue because this sampler had been exhibited by Whitney, and it is described as a boy. But I think by 1850, the fashion for dressing boys, very young boys, in girls' clothing was passing out of fashion. And I also think that because the little figure has an apron, I suspect that this figure might be a little girl, but we do not know. I don't think that we can say because the little figure has short hair it's either a boy or a girl, because boys didn't have their hair cut until they went into breeches. So the length of hair doesn't give us a clue whether it's a boy or girl. I think that apron is the clue, and that is a little girl. It's very sweet because she's going like this. I just think that's adorable. What she's doing, I don't know. You can't tell from the scene. Maybe she's just enjoying life in the sunshine in her garden. So I'm sorry I can't say what the little girl was doing or the little boy. Next question is, what was the size of the original? Well, this sampler was exhibited by Whitney Antiques, and it is mentioned in the exhibition catalogue, which is, just one moment, I've got it written down. It's the A to Z of British 18th and 19th century samplers. And in the booklet, in the exhibition catalogue, it is recorded that the frame size is 16.5 inches by 21.5 inches. The design area is approximately 12 by 16.5, and in the booklet we do specify the size fabric that it was stitched on, and I believe that that was 20 count Penelope canvas. We've had another question about the border, asking, was the border stitched first or added last? Well, we don't know. That's a very difficult question to answer. The reason that this has been raised is because the inner border, the flowers and the leaves, they run into the outer border. Now, these little girls, when they were stitching their samplers, they were given a piece of linen, and they were expected to make the best possible use out of that linen. And because they were the majority of them would have been stitching in hand, they would have been encouraged to go to the edge of their linen. Whether they started in the centre and worked out, or whether they put an edge, border pattern around first, we would have to ask them what they did. Just as some of us start in the centre and some of us start top left, each little girl would have done things slightly differently. It may have been the way that her needlework teacher taught her to work her sampler. Quite often with samplers, you see the borders are squidged in. They are made to fit. So you can often tell where they started on the border and where they ended up, purely from where they got their maths wrong. So they had to sort of squidge those stitches in at the end. Sometimes you can see where they have maybe stitched the border and then they found their motif wouldn't fit in, so they then stitched over. So that would tell us the border was stitched first and the inside of the sampler second. Sometimes you can see it the other way around, where the body of the sampler has been stitched, and then you can see the stitches of the border being laid over stitches that have already been laid. Unfortunately, I don't know with Margaret's sampler. That's something that I'm going to ask Sandra, who reproduced it, to ask her to take a closer look at that border, and for her to see if there's any evidence of stitches being laid over stitches. It's a difficult one because she would have had room possibly to have stitched a little bit more of these bottom flowers. So I think the fact that she stopped her flowers short, it was always an indication, sorry about that, it was always an indication that that border was going to be there. We will ask Sandra to take a closer look at the original sampler. Now, the original sampler may be with her grandchildren. Sandra's very kind to her grandchildren. Not only does she stitch samplers that are dedicated to them, she is trying to build up a little collection for each of her grandchildren, so they have got these original samplers. Berlin woolwork was very popular at the time Margaret's sampler was stitched and patterns were available. Was this a published pattern? Well, I strongly suspect that this middle motif was a published pattern. I haven't seen this border before, so I suspect that this border may have been the work of Margaret's needlework teacher, and it was a design that she had available for her pupils. Next question, let's have a look and see. This is a question from Teresa. You and I spoke earlier this year and you confessed to being completely enamoured with smaller samplers like Margaret's, and there are even people who collect primarily smaller samplers. What to you is the appeal of these works and what drew you to Margaret's sampler? When I first started stitching samplers, I wanted to stitch big samplers. I don't quite know why, but it was the big samplers that really caught my eye. But I think as I've found out more about samplers and I've learnt to appreciate them more, they didn't have to be big to catch my eye. And the smallest of samplers, you know, the small plain samplers, now catch my eye. So my taste is open to all samplers, whether they're big or small. I think that for me now, I have such, I'm running out of space in my home of where I can actually display my samplers. So I'm having to stitch small samplers just because that's all I've got room for. On a visit to the Fellers' home, I stopped and looked at one wall they had that was full of small samplers, and the impact of them was amazing. So big, they don't have to be big to catch my eye anymore. And I think as well that sometimes these smaller samplers were stitched by maybe some of the youngest of the girls, and that again endears them to me, that these are the first attempts of the little girl at needlework. And also sometimes, you know, the poorest of children, because they didn't get a proper education or any education at all, that it might have been their only sampler, and it was small because maybe the charity school or the church school, because they were, you know, they weren't being paid for it, only gave out small pieces of linen and limited numbers of threads. The small samplers, they seem more precious to me these days. It's very hard to explain something that's very sort of emotional for you, to you know, to put it into words, your emotions inside, and you know what your heart feels. Hands Across the Sea Samplers has so many wonderful titles, and each one has its own unique voice. Those of us living in America don't necessarily see antique samplers often, even in antique shops. What is the availability of samplers for sale like in the UK, and how on earth do you find so many wonderful samplers? Well, there is a big supply of samplers available, and that shows us just how many millions of samplers must have been stitched over the years throughout the world. You know, all little girls stitched. It didn't matter whether they were rich or they were poor. Every girl needed to learn to sew, and these samplers were the start of their needlework journey. Every week there are auctions being held throughout the UK, and many of them have samplers for sale in them. eBay is a source of samplers, although you do have to be very, very careful buying a sampler on eBay. Even buying at an auction, a reputable auctioneers, you know, it is always buyer beware. Like obviously if a proper auctioneer sold a sampler saying it was a sampler and it turned out to be a reproduction, and you could prove it was a reproduction, not an original sampler, the auctioneer would most likely give you your money back in the UK. Not on eBay, I'm talking about proper, you know, packer auctioneers. But it is a minefield. You do have to be careful when you're buying samplers. Always best to view them in person rather than to buy them online, although for many online is the only way they can buy them. So in the UK, it could be charity shops, it could be second-hand stores, it could be antique dealers, auctioneers, or it could be people selling on eBay or other second-hand online sites. But you do have to be careful. There are a lot of samplers available in the US as well. In the US, you know, there are lots of auctioneers, and obviously the US eBay is a very busy site as well. What always surprises me is the amount of British samplers you see for sale in America. And again, that shows that maybe when families emigrated, the children took their needlework with them. And you know, even adult women, they took their own schoolgirl needlework with them. And I'm sure that over the years that many American needleworkers have imported English schoolgirl samplers. Another question, what kind of resources do you use when investigating the stitch and the history? Well, we use Ancestry, Find My Past, Family Search. The British Newspaper Archive is an amazing resource. Those are the sites that we predominantly use. Every sampler has a backstory. Whether that little girl wants to share that backstory with you is another matter. Sometimes there's just not enough clues to pinpoint the little girl with accuracy. Take, for example, Florence Mary Dickinson. You would think with the name Florence Mary Dickinson that we would be able to pinpoint the little girl, but Florence didn't put a year on her sampler, and there are several Florence Mary Dickinsons. So with her, we couldn't share or you know, say this is our Florence. I love researching the stories behind the little girls. Margaret, she gave us her age and the year that she stitched it, so it gave us the year she was born. It told us where she stitched it, which was Belford, and she finished the sample on the 20th of February, which is my birthday. Because she stitched this in 1850 in Belford, there was a jolly good chance that in 1851, when the census was carried out, that we would find her in Belford. And we did. We found Margaret Doyle in Belford. So the census of 1851 in Belford gave us where she was born. So this is where you can start putting the story of the little girl together. The census returns are a wonderful source of history, and as the censuses go through the year, like the first census was 1841. The information on there is very sketchy. 1851, there was a little bit more information. 1861, 1871, 1881. By the time you get to 1901, they're asking quite a bit more information. But you really, get bingo on the 1911 census, because they ask how many years they were married, how many children they had, how many children were living. It actually shows a full address. Now, the 1922 census is not available on Ancestry. You have to go to Find My Past for the 1922 census. And then the 1930 odd census, it was just, the records were destroyed. I think it was because of World War II. And then in World War II, there wasn't a census carried out. So really, the 1922 is the last valuable resource that we have for researching samplers. Gosh, I sort of drifted a bit there with that one. Okay, next questions. I know you're proud of all the reproductions in the Hats catalogue. Is there a sampler in the collection that you are particularly fond of, and what is it about that sampler that makes it near and dear to your heart? Oh my gosh, that is such a hard one. My current favourite sampler is Florence Mary Dickinson. This sampler, when you see it in real life, you're not looking at it through the lens of a camera. The colours in this sampler are amazing. And the details, the coverage. This is my current favourite sampler. But, it's very difficult. How do you choose between your children? Which is your favourite children? And that's what I feel about samplers. Some samplers have such a touching backstory that you will always feel very sort of protective and maternal towards them. It is such a difficult question. I'm so sorry, Teresa. It's not a fair question to ask a mother about her girls. Next one was, do you ever hear from someone who says they're related to one of the girls who stitched a hat sampler? Yes, I have. And what I do when I research a sampler, if I actually find a living descendant for that girl, I do try and reach out to them to let them know that there is needlework from one of their ancestors. And, to be quite honest with you, if they wanted to have the sampler, I would actually let them have it for what I paid for it, because I do believe that samplers belong with the family if they want them. And of course, you see, then you could say, well, why did the family get rid of them? But there's many lines of a family. Something that I value that my great-grandmother stitched might not be valued by my second or third cousin. And the sampler may have passed down another line and got sold, whereas if it went down a particular line, it would be a cherished family heirloom. Anyway, I'll tell you one of the most amazing stories. I took a sampler into my framers. It was an antique sampler I bought, and I wanted it, I'd conserved it, and I wanted it put back into a frame. And my framer said, oh, he said, that's my family name. And he said, oh, you know, where did this sampler come from? Well, when I bought the original sampler, there was a typed card on the back of the sampler that laid out the family history. So I shared this with my frame, and he said, you know what, he said, I'm sure this is my family. He said, I'm going to contact my cousin, who is the family historian. Well, within an hour, he rang me to say this sampler was stitched by my ancestor. And I can't remember what, it was a grandmother, and I can't remember whether it was a great-grandmother or a great-great-grandmother. So my framer ended up with that sampler, and it's in his office, very proudly displayed on his wall. That is such a coincidence, because we're in Cornwall, and this sampler was stitched in Colchester, which is on the on the east coast of England, and we're on the furthest southwest point of England. Are there any more questions? Okay, in your opinion, what do you think is appealing today about antique samplers and sampler reproductions, and why are so many stitchers fond of them? That's a difficult one, because again, it's very emotive. These little girls, they are our forebearers. The life that we lead today in the 21st century in the Western world, the rights and privileges that women have, were hard fought for by those that went before. Yet there is so little recorded about ordinary females from centuries past. Yet we have these samplers, which is their work that has survived. They are so, so precious. And when you read their stories, when you research them and you put together their stories, you realise how hard their lives were. They really, really were. I find I have a great connection to the past. I've always loved history. And I do think that needlework makes the world a very small place. We are all interconnected through our love of the needle. It's one big sisterhood, brotherhood, family. These are very, very precious. When you look back at the history of civilization, the needle plays such an important role in that for the survival of mankind. And it's women who've passed on needlework down the generations. And at the present time, we are the custodian of the needle, of needlework skills and these samplers. You never own a sampler, you are the custodian of it. And it's really, really important, not only do we pass these samplers down to future generations, but we also pass needlework skills down the generations as well. And we can do that by stitching in public, by maybe talking to children about needlework, by, you know, entering your work into a craft show. You know, you go to shows sometimes and there's no samplers, there's no reproduction samplers in that show. Enter your work in, and when people come and view the crafts on display, they see a reproduction sampler. You know, we have to promote samplers, and again, I'm starting to waffle, so I'm going to stop on that point with that one. Have you ever found anything with a sampler, maybe inside the back of the sampler, that was a surprise or another bit of history? Well, something you often find in the back of samplers are newspapers, you know, just a piece of newspaper that's maybe acting as a cover for the back of the sampler. Those are always very, very interesting, and it makes you wonder, was that particular newspaper added because there's a story that relates to the little girl? So I always read them, you know, I read everything on those pieces of newspapers just in case. I haven't found that yet though. I did find a train schedule, a train timetable, and the little girl's father was a station master, so obviously he had access to the train timetables, and it must have been a handy thing. Maybe he framed his little girl's sampler himself, and that's why he used the train timetable from the station that he was a station master in. I've often found you know, pictures, drawings, things like that in the back of the sampler. You never know, it's always a thrill to open them up, although if they are properly conserved, I really don't like opening them up. But there we are. Anyway, those were some questions asked by Teresa and the ladies in the stitch along. If we have some more questions from them, we can do another video. If you are interested in stitching Margaret Doyle's sampler, these booklets, Teresa sold out of all the booklets only, but she does have a handful of the Soir d'Alger kits and some DMC kits, so you are able to get this booklet if you buy it as part of a thread pack. Maybe if you wrote to Teresa and asked her if she would sell you just the booklet, she might, I don't know. This is something that is solely available through Teresa, but such a beautiful sampler. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope that you are enjoying stitching Margaret, and I can't wait to see some more finished Margarets. Isabella finished Margaret in the last few days, and she posted this photograph. It's so beautiful. Isabella is an amazing needle worker, and she is very prolific as well. So anyway, hopefully all those participating in the stitch along will soon have their framed Margaret Doyles to hang on their sampler wall. Okay, bye.